Hello and welcome to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny coming to you guys today with a great show, a very special show here today. Going into the segment, later in the show, I'm going to talk about the potential interest of Brandon Ayuk that he has with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and as well, talking about the new Netflix series that's coming out called Receiver, following last year's Netflix series, Quarterback, that followed a few of the quarterbacks. Now it's heading towards receivers, following them after this past season. And in the first half of the show, I'll talk about, with my guest today, about Alexander Mattison going to the Las Vegas Raiders and Chris Sims' latest wide receiver rankings on the top prospects in the NFL draft. But without further ado, I mentioned today was a very special episode. It's my very first guest on today's episode, and I'm pretty sure it's also his first time starring on another episode. So I have today the host of the GSMC Football Podcast weekdays as well. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Kenneth Gruenfelder joining us here today.
I appreciate the introduction, Manny. Thank you. And yes, it is the first time. Like, I've had a couple of guests on my show, but yeah, this is the first time that I am a guest starring on another show. So it is great to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here. And before I get into that first segment, like I mentioned about Alexander Mattison and the development going over to the Las Vegas Raiders, I want to make sure to just remind everyone real quick to use the tip and donations link at gsmcpodcast.net with any questions, comments that you want to say during this live episode. It's always a lot more fun, more conversational when you guys are able to do that. So again, the tip and donations link is gsmcpodcast.net. It's always appreciated from everyone here at the network whenever you guys are able to do that with any of your questions. But going back to the topic I had at hand, the chip shot story, as always, revolving around Alexander Mattison and the Las Vegas Raiders. I mentioned it. He signed with the Raiders back on Monday. It was the first team that he visited with on Monday. And like most people that go to Las Vegas, they tend to stay there. And he signed with them on the I think it was a one-year deal. I'm not quite sure. I remember that. But he does already join a backfield with Amir Abdullah, Zamir White, who was the starter towards the end of last season. And that's where I wanted to start with you, Kenneth, on today's episode. You saw the way that the Raiders kind of ended last season. Josh Jacobs was in and out. They kind of found something very surprisingly with Zamir White. I was able to catch some of their games and was pretty impressed with what they did. What were your overall thoughts of Alexander Mattison joining now Amir Abdullah and Zamir White when that deal was first announced?
I mean, I think it's really for depth. Because Alexander Mattison was with Minnesota for a while, and he was kind of that guy that filled in for Dalvin Cook whenever Dalvin Cook missed time, and he did a nice job. But then he finally got the keys, to the city and was the lead back, and it just like really did not pan out. He really did not play that well. I think he had three total touchdowns, but like two of them were like receiving touchdowns. Really did not have an impact with the Vikings, and that's why they went out and they traded for Cam Akers, and then he unfortunately tore his Achilles. So they bring him in. I mean, Zamir White, yeah, he did a very nice job filling in for Josh Jacobs when he missed time. He was kind of one of the reasons why I lost in my semifinals in my fantasy playoffs. He ran for 145 yards, 145 yards against the Chiefs on Christmas. And I actually like didn't. He got most of those yards like towards the end of the game, and I actually like wasn't watching the game. I was keeping track of it on my phone, and I was like, he was doing nothing the whole game, and then he decides to go off at the end. So yeah, I mean, I guess change the scenery. We'll see what happens for Madison. But I guess at the moment you have to look at Zamir White as probably being like the lead back for the Raiders.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one way to do it. Of course, if Madison plays well, he could have more touches, but I do like the quantity that they have, or maybe you could argue quality of instead of getting one very high caliber back in like a Saquon or a Derrick Henry come in. I think just overall getting three guys to try and replace Josh Jacobs will probably end up being the best scenario for them. In an AFC West that I kind of want to transition into now, you've seen the Raiders make some pretty big moves, probably the biggest move in adding Christian Wilkins to pair him up with Max Crosby. So I want to get your thoughts on that. On top of where do you see them in comparison to, say, the Chargers, who have really lost people, a lot more people than they've added? What are your thoughts on those two things?
Well, I think the biggest thing with the Raiders is their defense. I mean, that's been a problem for years now. And you saw once Antonio Pierce took over, there was a difference. And especially I'll go back to that game on Christmas. I mean, yeah, they capitalized on the Chiefs' mistakes, but still, like they went in there and they beat the Chiefs in Arrowhead, which is not very easy. And they didn't complete a pass after the first quarter, which again was amazing that they were able to do that. I like the direction that they're heading in going into next year. I mean, the biggest thing now is what they're going to do at quarterback. I mean, they signed Gardner Minshew. You still have Aiden O'Connell there. Those guys aren't the long-term answers. I mean, O'Connell, he was okay, I guess. And Gardner Minshew, listen, he did a nice job. When he had to take over as a starter for the Colts when Anthony Richardson went down. And he's kind of bounced around a little bit since he started out with the Jaguars. So I like the moves that they've made. Again, losing Josh Jacobs is going to hurt a little bit, but you still have Devontae Adams there. Jacoby Myers was decent for him. Trey Tucker, their rookie, as well. Michael Mayer, they're expecting bigger things out of him in year two. So they got weapons. They just got to find the right guy at quarterback. And yeah, you also want to continue to, build up this defense too. But definitely adding Christian Wilkins helps to pair him with Max Crosby, like you said. But for me, when you also look at the Chargers, they have the quarterback in place. I mean, the roster looks a little different now on offense because you have all the guys that Herbert played with mostly. They're all gone now. You got Joshua Palmer, Quentin Johnston. You bring in Gus Edwards, and they're probably going to add a running back in the draft. I would imagine. So the Chargers are going to look different next year. So right now they're probably fighting for second, third place, and then the Broncos. I mean, you got Russell Wilson's cap hit, which is a lot. So they really got to figure something out there. But yeah, I mean, right now you're looking at the Chargers and the Raiders second and third. I think the Broncos are probably that fourth place team, and then of course there's the Chiefs, who they're ahead of everybody else. So again, the gap is going to close, I think. I think with Harbaugh now with the Chargers, they're going to head in the right direction. And the Raiders, again, we'll see it with Antonio Pierce, now taking over for a full season. We'll see how that pans out. But I like the direction that they're heading in. The Broncos, again, it's tough with the Russ cap situation that they have, but they put it upon themselves. They're the ones that released him, and they paid him the extension before he even played, for them. So that's kind of how I see the whole division.
Yeah, and it's interesting that last part you mentioned there about giving a player that extension before they've even played. We saw it similarly happen just I think a few days now with Jerry Jeudy and the Cleveland Browns. He was on an expiring deal and they extended him. And regardless if you think that's good or not, there's always a talk about potential being there, and that's really what gets these teams to pay that amount of money. But in terms of still sticking with the AFC West and the Raiders, I think now, like a few weeks ago, maybe almost a month ago, I'm sure you saw those comments made by Antonio Pierce and kind of relating it back to the Jordan rules and trying to stop Patrick Mahomes
Yeah, I
comparing
did a
it.
segment on that. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and I also did a segment on it, and to me that just screams like defense, defense. They're trying to fortify their defense, which they have. But do you think now, with the Kansas City Chiefs getting Marquise Brown, really shoring up the only weak part of their defense, or their team overall, I should say, do you think only focusing on defense is the way to have continual success against the Chiefs and really throughout that whole division?
Well, I think you also need to have a quarterback that can go toe to toe with Patrick Mahomes. And right now the Broncos have Jared Stidham, and the Raiders, like I said, Gardner Minshew's a nice player, and you have Aiden O'Connell, but that you can't compete with Patrick Mahomes with those two quarterbacks. Justin Herbert has beaten Patrick Mahomes, and when they go toe to toe, it's pretty much a one score game almost every single time. So you also need to have that too. And right now, the Broncos and the Raiders don't have that. Now, you thought the Broncos were going to get it with Russell Wilson, and that just did not pan out at all. Um, again, like I said, the Raiders, their problem for years was defense. And you know what? Maybe they should have kept Derek Carr around, but again, that was a Josh McDaniels thing. That relationship really just did not work. He wanted his guy. He goes and gets Garoppolo, and look how that turned out. So that's the other thing too, is you need to have a quarterback that can go toe to toe with Mahomes. And right now, the only one in that division is Justin Herbert. So that's the other thing too. And the other thing I'd say about the Chiefs too is, like you said, what they were missing the last couple of seasons was those explosive plays. And is Marquise Brown the same player that Tyreek Hill is? No. But if, on a 1 year deal, a guy that can go deep and take the top off the defense, I mean, if they're able to add that dimension back into their offense, this team is going to be even better next year. They retained pretty much all their guys. I mean, we'll see what happens with L'Jarius Sneed, because he could possibly be a guy that ends up getting traded, even though they franchise tagged him. But bringing back Chris Jones is huge. So, the defense is pretty much going to be the same as it was in 2023. And that was the strength of the team. But now if Marquise Brown can be like how he was with the Ravens, that only helps out Rashee Rice. That helps out Travis Kelce. And the other thing, too, is it helps out the running game, too, because Isaiah Pacheco, he's a late round pick for them. And he's been solid for them first couple of seasons. And we're talking about this. The Chiefs have won the last two Super Bowls, and this is without Tyreek Hill. And you have analysts coming out and saying, "Oh, they still miss him." Well, yeah, maybe they do miss him, but they're winning, even despite missing him. So, if Marquise Brown is an impact player for this team, I mean, again, they're going to have those explosive plays again, and that's something that a lot of teams in the AFC are not going to want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I completely share all those sentiments with you. It's crazy how, you know, with talking about the Chiefs, and this is the last thing I'll say before I wrap this segment, is that, we said that last season, you heard a lot of people say that last season was their worst team. And when you get a worse team with a lot of these other NFL teams, they'll have a bad record or they'll just scrap the season. A bad season for the Chiefs ended up still winning a Super Bowl, like you said, which is insane. And it just speaks volumes to not only the kind of players that they have, but really for me, it's the organization from top to bottom. Andy Reid, one of the best coaches, not only in the league, but ever. They know how to win games. They know how to do it the right way, and it's showing. And they're on the verge of making history. And unfortunately for the rest of the AFC West, it might not look great, but that's where it stands right now. And that's where we're going to wrap this segment. I'm going to send it to a quick break right now. And on the other side of the break, we're gonna come back still with Kenneth on talking about Chris Sims's latest wide receiver rankings of the top prospects heading into this year's NFL draft. So don't go anywhere. A lot more to come on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.